trickier Hades. When I want to play fantasy, people point out D&D. When I want eldritch stuff, people point out Call of Cthulhu. What's the sci-fi equivalent for a TTRPG? There isn't really one. In fact, I honestly think that like eldritch, what you mean is Cthulhu stuff, because there isn't eldritch, I don't really think, outside of Cthulhu stuff. So obviously, if you want Cthulhu stuff, you want the Cthulhu game. I don't really think there is a science fiction version of Fantasyland. Fantasyland is a term that critics, fantasy critics, I mean literary critics, I don't mean people who are criticizing, but just people who write about fantasy as opposed to writing fantasy. Fantasyland is a term people used to criticize the low effort, low quality setting of all of these, of which there were literally thousands, now all obscure. Maybe the Shannara books are not as obscure, but they don't have used bookstores anymore. But if they did, and you went to a used bookstore and you looked in the fantasy section, you would be astonished to see just how many. Because remember, novels like this is not a great example because this is a large format version that they publish on purpose to make it look bigger than it is. Because this exact same book came out when I was a kid and it was this big and much thinner. But they want to impress people now with it, so they print the exact same book much larger. You would be astonished. This is cheap. This is cheap. This is disposable. We are the inheritors of the greatest generation's attitudes toward value, which includes things like having lived through the Great Depression, and their parents could not afford to own more than 2 or 3 books because books were expensive. But my grandparents lived through the explosion of pulp fiction. Literally cheap. The paper was pulp. And that means these were millions of science fiction and fantasy novels were published, read, and thrown away. But we, because we have this very kind of Puritan Calvinistic attitude toward material things, we think that books or the actual paper is precious. And don't write in it. Oh, good Lord. Don't, and keep it nice and keep it. But in reality, the stuff it cost almost nothing to make and cost almost nothing to buy, which is why normal people could suddenly afford to buy novels and books and stuff. And so there was a huge fucking explosion of really low quality fantasy, all of it very derivative in through mostly the 1970s, which I used to go to used bookstores on purpose and look for this stuff and read some of it. And some of it was a lot of fun or really interesting, but mostly from a historical point of view. And D&D succeeds on the back of that idea of Fantasyland, which is largely, I would say, 11th to 13th century medieval Western Europe. It comes with a whole bunch of built-in things. Like if I say science fiction, you don't know if that means faster than light travel or not. And that's a big fucking deal. But if I say fantasy, it's horses. How do we get from one town to another? On a horse. How fast can we go? Well, as fast as a horse goes, right? Well, where will we stay when we get there? At an inn, right? What will we eat? Well, probably not beef, probably chicken, duck, lamb, bread, cheese. All that stuff's built in. You don't need to go look in the rule book and figure out how does this work. Science fiction doesn't work that way. Science fiction covers vastly different. Science fiction covers stuff like The Matrix and Dune. The Matrix is set in the near future. Dune is set, so there's no built-in default. That's one of the reasons D&D is so successful, is because of the existence of Fantasyland. So let's take a look at. Well, yeah, chop boxer. Fantasyland is a term that covers a lot because the people writing it aren't historians. And if they were historians, it would have made their books better. So let's take a look at what's going on here. This is not a high quality map of it, but it might look